examination, and it was set up consistent with an old Earth theistic evolution mindset, which is we're going to casually go into this. Yeah. 5 hours is maybe more than your typical definition of casual.
That is casual, isn't it?
But it's not set up as you said this, I said this, now interact.
Debate, yeah.
So some of the things I think are worth repeating that you can find in Dr. Venema's book. He never quotes, never engages a single young Earth argument.
Really?
And if you look at their website, it's very similar. Almost exclusively no engaging of our arguments.
Is that because he's not reading our material, you think?
I guess that's what each person has to decide. And that was one question I hope would come up with the Q&A, which is, how do I explain the 9 to 7%? And my answer was going to be, and I published this answer, I put it in the book, they don't read our literature. They don't seem to be familiar with what we've published. And here's a potential explanation for why. You look at the few things he does cite. He cites blog, personal blog, basically, as if that reflects the young Earth movement in general. And he talks about a particular author and says, well, this author who says that there's good evidence for evolution, this person is just being honest about the state of the evidence for evolution.
Well, that would make you then dishonest, is that right?
Wouldn't it? And
he's quoting a blog for that.
Yes, and he also says this person's approach is unique among the young Earth literature in that it is thoroughly accurate and does not misrepresent the data. And you can ask the same question on there too. So is what I've published, what you've published, what Jeff Tompkins has published, does that mean, what's the dictionary definition of unique? Does that mean we have misrepresented the data and it's inaccurate? He never cites a single example or points out what specifically we've done. And you can see that not only in what he writes there. About a year and a half ago, I engaged a different member of BioLogos, Daryl Falk, at the Evangelical Theological Society meeting. BioLogos wrote a blog post. There was one of the commenters who basically called me a dishonest fraud, dangerous to society. It was pretty harsh. That's fine. Water off a duck's back. The reason I bring it up is BioLogos claims to be committed to humility and gracious dialogue with those who disagree. And if you read their forum, they pat themselves on the back about that often. In fact, that's one of the points they have declined engaging me in times past. Dennis Venema was supposed to engage me at ETS and didn't because he thought it was coming. The invitation was coming from Answers in Genesis, and we just have this nasty tone. But they call us liars. And it isn't just BioLogos who does this. You look at the American Scientific Affiliation, which is probably the biggest. I think it's got 2,000 members. Organization of professional scientists. Probably not young Earthers. And their former president, Randy Isaacs, who was president for about 10 years, he had an exit interview, retired recently. He was part of the BioLogos Advisory Council for I don't know how long, but he said it was okay to be a young Earther in the ASA, the American Scientific Affiliation, under two scenarios. One, if you say that it looks like God created a universe that appears to be billions of years old. Or if you say, I believe the Bible says this, but I can't figure out the science. But what he says, what about our position? Claims that scientific data affirm a young Earth do not meet the criterion of integrity of science. The ASA can and does oppose such deception. So why don't they read our literature? Because they think we're liars. That's the easiest explanation. It comes straight from what they've published, what they've said, what they've put in print. If you think this person is a dishonest fraud, of course you're not going to engage what they say. And I think that became apparent again. I think that's apparent in Dr. Venema's book. You can see it in the presentation again. If you happen to watch it, who seems familiar with the other side and who totally ignores it. And part of the reason I bring up these claims about them calling us liars is I actually thought I had a pretty good strategy that would preemptively rebut what he said, and I knew he was going to come across as Mr. Nice, and well, this would seem to be in contrast. What does someone like that do when someone presents this sort of evidence? They ignore it.
They just ignored it.
Just like the rest of our literature. So you'll never see him in the Q&A deny that he thinks we're liars. You won't see him engage that argument. In fact, I asked him point blank a couple of times, in light of the evidence I presented on genetics and on Adam and Eve, where I make testable predictions, the gold standard of science basically for many years, even from the evolutionists' own pens, is young Earth creation science. Point blank twice. Both times he basically refused to ask it. I asked him point blank, can you make a testable prediction on the data that I discussed? And basically he said, no, we can't. I said, well, should evolution be called science? And he kind of punted that question as well. So
get rid of that one.
why not just say, yes, you've met the standard, or this is a tough question, well, they think we're liars. That's what it really comes down to. So you see it illustrated there as well. Of course, they'll pontificate about how open-minded they are. Again, I would encourage anyone watching the debate, or who looks at that debate, looks at that book, where is the evidence of that claim? He says, it doesn't matter what your presupposition is in publishing the evolutionary literature. I could probably even state this stronger. Not only does he not read our literature, I don't know that he reads his own.
Wow.
You look at what happened when the ENCODE project came out. This was the comprehensive, massive, functional testing of every single letter in the human DNA sequence. Billions of letters of genetic sequence.
Yeah.
It was biochemistry. It's preliminary. The authors said we have evidence that at least 80% of the human DNA is biochemical function. It's preliminary, and maybe some of the claims are overstated. Well, one of the strong reactions from the evolutionary community was, I think the subtitle of the article was, the title was on the immortality of television sets, critiquing the evolution-free gospel of ENCODE. Basically, the point was these secular scientists, they're not creationists who are pushing this genetic finding. Secular scientists are totally in error because they've ignored evolution. My point of bringing all that up is to say, this is a peer-reviewed paper, evolution is not a hypothesis that is being debated and questioned in the evolutionary literature that I could just submit a young Earth answer to and say, consider this. Evolution is a test by which things are measured in the evolutionary literature. So it is not accurate for Dr. Venema to say scientists are open-minded and any hypothesis. No, in fact, to me, what the most interesting element was, to go back to that question we had earlier, he was asked, Dr. Venema was asked, well, what would change your mind? Venema began the Q&A by asking me what would change my mind. So the moderator asked him that question to close the evening. And he kind of danced around it and said, well, there's a lot of evidence, and implied basically if the scientific consensus would change, he might, but didn't think it. And then just there at the end dropped, by the way, there's a lot of other evidence we could have discussed tonight, like geology, that would refute the young Earth literature. So what was pointed out to me at the end, which was really interesting, was I began that entire dialogue by saying, who do you trust? Me or Dr. Venema, basically, or more generally, me and the dissenters, or the 97%, including Dr. Venema. And when I asked what would change Dr. Venema's mind, he didn't cite genetic evidence. He basically punted it to another field. So in a sense, who do you trust? To me, basically what he said was, you should trust me because I trust the geologists.
Yeah.
Because there's all this geology which he's not trained in.
Right.
So you can see the circle of reasoning that exists in the evolutionary literature.
Yeah.
Among evolutionary colleagues. So
they just punt it to each other.
Yeah. So I thought it was a really interesting debate. Again, you could almost predict which direction each of us would go. You can see, hopefully get some hints as to why each side, how each side explains the other. Liars is what they call us, and I'd say they're just not reading our literature on the other side.
Well, we're about out of time. So if Dr. Venema was to talk to you, and you guys were to, and he was to ask you, hey, what about the 97% and vice versa? How would you deal with that?
I'd ask him if he could answer the question for me, which was interesting, because at the beginning of this whole session, Dr. Keithley had said that the moderator, that one of the marks of a good debate is, can you articulate your opponent's position and then refute it? Can you do it better than your opponent can?
Yeah.
And that's basically that test I'd use for Dr. Venema.
How do you think he would have answered?
He probably would have said, I don't know, which was interesting because I published the answer, which is they don't read the literature.
That means they're not reading the literature. Well, we are out of time officially.